Hi everyone, today we're going to have a look at how we can place objects on surfaces of other objects. I have prepared a Cinema 4D file with a modified cube. You can download this file if you want to. And I've also prepared a couple of objects that we can place on surfaces. So here you can see some bolts and screw heads that I did a while ago. We're going to have a look at how we can place objects using the Cinema 4D tools, and we're also going to have a look at a couple of plugins that you can use to make that job easier. Placing objects on surfaces of other objects is something that you need all the time to add detail to your models. So it is something that is actually quite important. So it's probably a good idea to learn what we can do to get those objects on those surfaces here. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to move objects around. And in order to do that, I will just pick one of these objects and copy it and drag it out of this null so we can focus on this one. So usually in order to move an object around, you can select it, you can use the axes to move it around. And you can also left click anywhere in the viewport with the object selected to move it. But watch what happens. If I left click, my cursor is down here, the object is over there. If I left click and drag, this is what happens. The object always keeps that distance from the cursor. And that of course is not very useful. One thing you can do is zoom in, left click on the object and move it around, and it will stay a lot closer to the cursor. What I like to do, however, in order to move these objects, and we're going to need that anyway, is I like to use snapping. And if you switch snapping on, you can do that over here by clicking on this button. You can also hit the P key in the viewport to enable snapping or to disable it. If I undock that and enable it, you can see my default snap settings here. So this is what I usually need for snapping, and this is not the default in Cinema 4D. I have saved this, so every time I open Cinema 4D or create a new file, and when I switch on snapping, this is what I'll get. And if you want to do the same thing, I can show you that quickly. Let's just create a new file. So what you need to do is create a new file and then just undock the snapping options here, enable snapping, and then you pick all of the options that you need. And once you've done that, disable snapping, close this window, and then you need to save that file. And actually you need to save two files. Let's go to Edit Preferences. And at the bottom here, you can see a button that says Open Preferences folder. If you click on that, you will jump to the Preferences folder of your Cinema 4D installation. And you can see we have two files in here. You probably won't have those because these are not installed. When you install Cinema 4D, you need to actually create them. And you can see that one of these files is called template.c4d and the other one is called new.c4d. Template.c4d is for when you start Cinema 4D, this is the file that Cinema 4D will use. If you have Cinema 4D already open and create a new file, Cinema 4D will use this new.c4d file as the template, and it will come in with all of the settings that you saved. So if I just close that. So once you've made these changes, you need to go to File, Save As, navigate to your Preferences folder and save a template.c4d file, and then save that file again and call it new.c4d. Then close Cinema 4D and restart Cinema 4D, and you should have those new settings in there. So this is something that is a little bit confusing in Cinema 4D because there's a number of things, like if I go to Filter, Grid and switch that on, if I close Cinema 4D and restart it, the grid will show. If I switch that off, close Cinema 4D and open it, you will get this scene file here without the grid. If you have tools like, I don't know, the knife tool, I can't do anything with it right now because I don't have an object, so I'll just create one. And let's go to polygon mode. You can see the options here. And if you want to change something here, you can, for example, switch off visible only if that is what you need in most cases. So make all the changes that you want, and then you can go to edit. set as default, and Cinema 4D will always recognize these settings. And you don't have to save a template.c4d or a new.c4d file. So depending on what changes you make, sometimes Cinema 4D will remember it immediately. Sometimes you have to save those template and new.c4d files like I just showed you. Okay, so let's just close this file. I'm not going to save that. And let's move this object around and snap it to maybe this top surface here. So I have a snapping switched on, and I don't need to worry about what settings I have because I always have my default settings here. So I already know what I'm going to snap to. In this case, it's a good idea to have polygon snap switched on. I don't need this that often, so that is not part of my default. In this case, we do need it, so let's go ahead and switch it on. And like I said, you can go over here to activate or deactivate snapping. You can hit the P key. Personally, I prefer to use a shortcut. I have a custom one, which is Shift E. And if you want to do the same thing, you can go to Windows, Customization, and Customize Commands. Type in Enable Snap, and you will get these two hits. What you need is Enable Component Snapping. That's the one that you want to create a shortcut for. And then you can just add a shortcut, assign it, and then you can use it. And this also is something that Cinema 4D will remember immediately, and there's no need to save a template or new.c4d file. So I have switched on snapping. Now if I left click and drag in the viewport, the object will jump to the cursor and we can move it around and snap it to that top surface here. And if I go to my right view, you can see we've placed it on this top surface here. Now I could also snap it to this polygon here and then just rotate it 90 degrees. So placing these objects on straight surfaces is not a big problem. It gets a little more difficult if we want to put it on a surface like this, for example. And again, I have snapped it to this surface. Let's go to the right view, hit S to center the object, and now we need to rotate this object to orient it along this surface here. And of course you can always eyeball it, but I prefer to use axis center to, rotate it precisely. And what you need to do is switch on snapping. We need to activate the rotate tool, and then what we need to do is hold down Control, right click on this red circle which represents the x-axis, then we need to snap to the bottom of the object, left click and hold the left mouse button and drag, and you're getting this white line, and then you just move this line and snap it to the surface of the object here, and it's perfectly aligned to that surface now. I'll just go back a few steps and maybe move this over. So that's a relatively quick way of placing an object like this. However, things get a little more complicated if you have a surface like this. And you can still, snap the object to that polygon and then try to rotate it and eyeball it to get it on that surface, but it's a little bit cumbersome and a bit of a pain. So we need to find a way to make this task a little easier. And what we can do to make positioning objects on slanted surfaces easier is to use the Workplanes over here. And we have these options, and we also have these options here. And we're going to have a look at the top options first. So let's say we want to put this bolt on this surface here. I'm just going to close this window here. What we need to do is select the cube, switch to polygon mode, and I'll just switch off snapping here. I'm going to select this polygon and I'm going to set the selection. And now what we can do is we can align the workplane to this selection. So let's click on this option here. You can't really see a big change here. Maybe you noticed that the world axis moved over to here. If I go to filter and switch on the grid, you can see what happened. So the workplane was aligned to this surface here. And now what we can do to place this object on this surface is, unfortunately, we can't use reset position scale rotation. If I open a new file quickly, and I'll just add a cube. So let's say I move this cube over to here, move it up a little bit and rotate it. In order to center this cube on the work plane again, provided I'm using the default Cinema 4D work plane, is I can go to Character, Commands, and use an option called Reset PSR, Position, Scale, Rotation. There is no Cinema 4D default shortcut. I have a custom one because I use that all the time. So if I use Reset Position, Scale, Rotation, the object will be centered on the grid again. It will be aligned to the work plane. Let's say I have another cube and I'll move it over here. Again, I'm going to rotate it a little bit. And let's say I want this cube to be lined up with this object here. I can also use Reset Position Scale Rotation, but what I need to do first is make this object a child of the other cube. And now if I Reset Position Scale Rotation, the object will assume the position and the rotation of that other object, and I can scale it down and put it on this surface here. Okay. And if I want everything back to the grid, I'll just remove that cube as a child and then hit Reset PSR. Let's do the same thing for this object, and both of them are again aligned to the default work plane. Unfortunately, that's not how it works if you have your work plane changed to something like this. If I used Reset Position Scale Rotation on this object, you can see it doesn't end up on this surface here. And if I open or undock this window here again, if I reset my work plane to the default, which is Y, so align work plane to Y, you can see that our bolt has just been centered on the default Cinema 4D grid again. So that's not very useful. I'll just undo that, move that object back over there, select that cube again, align the work plane to the selection, select my bolt, and there's two ways I can align this object to the work plane. One is to use this option here, Align Selection to Work Plane. So let's go ahead and do that. And you can see the object ends up here. Now that's not perfect, but it's okay because I can move the object along the work plane and put it on my surface here. And now I can reset my work plane. If I want to, I can make copies. If I switch to the local coordinate system, I can move that copy around and it will stay aligned on that surface here. Now I'm just going to do that again, align the work plane to the selection. The other way, I can move this object to the work plane and center it on the work plane, like we can with the Cinema 4D default grid when we use Reset Position Scale Rotation, is I can select the object. And let's have a look down here at the Coordinates Manager. By default, this is set to Object Relative, by the way. What we need to do is zero out the position values and the rotation values. If I do this with the default setting here, Object Relative, what will happen is the same thing that happens when we use Reset Position Scale Rotation. The object will just be aligned to the default grid. So what we need to do here is to switch from Object Relative to World. And you can see these numbers change. We also have a rotation value now. And what we need to do is zero out all of these numbers and then hit Apply. And this time the object doesn't end up somewhere up here. And I think the reason it does end up here is because Cinema 4D uses a line going from the object to the work plane and hitting that work plane perpendicularly, and it just projects the object perpendicularly to that work plane, and that's why it ends up here. So if you don't want that, you need to switch the option down here from Object Relative to World and then zero out all of these numbers. And As you can see, this requires quite a few steps. It's not a perfect solution, but it's something we can use to put the object at the center of this workplane here. Next, we're going to have a look at the second set of workplane options available to us in Cinema 4D. I'll just reset the workplane to Y, close that window, and I'm going to go back a few steps. So the second set of workplane options are these ones here. I'm going to undock that. And the option that we need is the interactive workplane. If I click on that, you can see a change here. And depending on the surface where my mouse is, the workplane will be aligned to that surface. It's not going to work for some of the surfaces, like this one, and I'm going to show you why in a second. So this is basically a faster way of getting your workplane aligned to a particular surface. But the problem is, once we hover over a surface like this one here and we want to lock the workplane, we need to go over here and lock the workplane. But as soon as I move my mouse away from this surface, you can see the workplane changes again. These options here will only really work if you assign shortcuts to them. There are no Cinema 4D default shortcuts. And if I go to Windows, Customization, Customize Commands, type in Interactive Workplane. So this is the option. You can see my shortcut for this is Shift Y. I also have a shortcut for Align Workplane to Y, because that's the option that I need most. And because we also need a shortcut for Locked Workplane, I'm going to show you this too. Locked Workplane, there we go. For me, this is Alt-C. So let's close that window, go back to our interactive workplane. I'm now using the shortcut, Shift Y. I can hover over this surface here and lock the workplane using Alt-C. And then we can select the bolt and use Align Selection to Workplane. And honestly, I also have a shortcut for that because it makes things a lot faster. Align Selection to Workplane, that is Alt-Y for me. Okay, so if I hit Alt-Y, the object is going to be aligned to that workplane and I can move it down and put it on that surface here. I'm going to activate the interactive workplane again, and I want to put it on this surface here. And you can see it's not working. For some reason, the workplane isn't aligned. Now, the reason this happens is because of the geometry of this object here. You can see we have an n-gon here. Cinema 4D doesn't seem to know where to put the workplane if you have geometry like this. So what we need to do is select these. Let me just undo that, lock the workplane, align it to the default, and I'm going to select these 2 points and connect them. We also need to, let's do this in the front view. We also need to remove the n-gons here. So with my knife tool selected, visible only is switched off. I'm going to make a cut here. So now we've removed the n-gons, we have proper topology, except here at the back. Let me just get rid of this n-gon as well. Sometimes it does work. Sometimes locking the workplane to n-gon surfaces does work, but in many cases, like these slanted surface here, you will run into difficulties. So that's just something you need to be aware of. Try and fix the geometry and try to avoid having non-planar polygons. You will get the same issue if you have non-planar polygons. So let's go back to model mode and activate the interactive workplane again. I'll just switch to the move tool, and now you can see we can align the surface. And then I'm going to select my bolt and align the selection to the workplane, and now I can move this bolt over and move it onto this surface here. Let's just reset the workplane to the default, and there we go. Now we've aligned the object to this workplane. At the beginning of the tutorial, I mentioned the AutoGrid function in 3ds Studio Max, and I also mentioned that we don't have something like that in Cinema 4D, However, with the Workplanes, we can get an effect that is kind of similar to what AutoGrid does in 3ds Studio Max. And for this, we also need to use or one of the options is to use the interactive workplane, which I'm going to do. I'm going to lock it to this surface here. And now, if you create a new object, like a primitive here, let's create a cube, you can see it gets centered on the workplane. And this is actually what happens if you create a new object. When you have the default grid, the object will be created at the center of that grid. It is kind of like drawing an object on a surface, but then again, not quite. And by the way, I'm not sure if you know that if I move my camera over here and I want to create an object, it's going to be created at the world center. If I don't want that, I can go to Edit, Preferences, and on the Interface tab here, there is an option to create the new object at the view center. If I click that option and create a cube, it's going to be created at the center of the viewport rather than at the center of the world grid. I'll just reset this to the default. I hardly ever use that. Let's go ahead and close that. I don't want to save it. So now we've aligned this object to this surface here just by changing the workplane. And like I said, whenever you create a new object, it will be centered on that workplane. Now the problem, of course, is that if I set the axis back, if I switch to the local coordinate system, grab my move tool, because of the way primitive objects are created in Cinema 4D, the axis, or rather the axis of this object, is at the center of that cube. Now, what if I want to align that cube, or the bottom of that cube, with that surface? Well, I need to move it up and snap it to that surface. Now you can see I changed the size of this cube. It is, let's use an even number. Let's do 40 by 40 by 40, which makes things a little bit easier. Now, if I create a cube on the default grid, it's 200 by 200 by 200. If I want to move it to the floor, all I need to do is move it up 100, so half the height of the object. Another way would be to make it editable. Move the axis to the bottom and use Reset Position Scale Rotation. Another option would be to put this in a null object, because we can't change the object axis of the primitive. I think there are plugins that can do that, but I don't have those. And what we can do now is switch on snapping, switch on enable axis. Over here I have shortcuts for all of this, and then what we can do is move the object axis down, switch off the object axis, and just move the object to 0 on the grid. So that's what you can do on the Cinema 4D default grid. I'm going to close this. I'm not going to save it. Now the problem is, if we have an object like this aligned to this surface here, and this cube is 40 by 40 by 40, we can't just move it up by 20 units. You can see we have all weird numbers here. So, I mean, we could eyeball it. We could use a null object. If I hold down my Alt key, when I add this, it will automatically assume the position and the rotation of this object, and then we can switch on enable axis, switch on snapping, move the axis to here, switch off enable axis, and then move that object and snap it to here. So that's one way of doing that. Another way of doing it is by selecting the object, and then if you go to the coordinates tab here in the attributes manager, you have the option to freeze the transformation. So let's hit freeze all, and you can see everything gets reset to 0. And now if I select this object, I should actually be able to, I forgot to change the setting down here. We need to switch that back to object relative, and you can see the numbers are zeroed out here as well now. And now we can just move it up 20 on the y-axis to put it on top of that surface. So unfortunately, changing the work plane is the only way to sort of draw objects on surfaces of other objects. So I can align the work plane to here and create another cube or a cylinder. Let's just get rid of that cube here. Scale that down a bit. Okay, so that's as close as we get to what 3ds Studio Max can do with AutoGrid. And a little bit later, I'm going to show you a plugin that you can use to actually interactively draw objects like you can do with AutoGrid in 3ds Studio Max. Unfortunately, some of you will be very sad because that plugin doesn't exist anymore. And well, that's one of the reasons why I'm glad I still have release 18, because I can still use that plugin. So I'm just going to reset the work plane, delete everything except our modified cube here. And we're going to have a look at one more option to place objects on surfaces of other objects. I'm just going to use reset position scale rotation on this bolt here and move it over. And the last option we're going to have a look at is MoGraph. We can use MoGraph to put objects on surfaces of other objects. And the way this works is you have the object here and you can put it in a cloner. And let's go ahead and set the cloner to object. The object will be the cube. And I'm going to switch off my grid here. So you can see what happens by default. And the reason that happens is because the distribution is set to vertex. We have a number of options here: edge, polygon center, surface, for example. And if I switch off align clone, yeah, not all of the clones get aligned to all of the surfaces. We also have the option to use polygon center, for example. And what happens if I switch on or off align clone? Again, we're not getting the alignment here, but what we should be able to do is select the cloner, go to the transform tab, and then use the rotation here to rotate these objects 90 degrees. And I should have rotated them minus 90 degrees to make them sit on top of the surface. So that's another way of aligning those objects. Of course, it's not very useful because we get a random distribution here on a number of surfaces. And let's say we only want to create some of these bolts on top of the top surface here. And what we can do to achieve that is select the cube, go to polygon mode, select this top polygon. I'm going to set this as a selection, and then I can go to my cloner and go to the object tab, and you can see down here we have an option to add a selection. I'm just going to drag this tag in there, and this will put the object on top of this surface here. Let's try and use the other selection we created earlier, see what happens. So again, the object gets aligned to this surface here, and well, as you can see, the cloner's object axis is over here. So usually what I would do is make the cloner editable. And the funny thing is, if you open the null object, you can see we have a couple of clones that are created here. I only need this one, so I'm just going to delete these two. And now we're left with this object here. And again, this will be aligned to the surface. We can move it, or we can create copies like this. And I'll just go back a few steps and switch off that cloner for now. We can also clone onto splines, but that honestly will only work so well depending on what you do. So let's select that cube. I'm going to maybe select this edge, go to mesh commands, edge to spline, and this will create a spline here. And now we can clone onto that spline instead of the cube. So I need to switch my cloner back on, and you can see we're getting this alignment here. And let's reset this to 0. The problem on surfaces like this is no matter if I use align clone or not, this is the way the objects get distributed, and the orientation of course needs to be changed. And this can be a bit of a problem because depending on whether or not you know the angle of the surface, you'll have to eyeball this to get an exact alignment of these cubes or of these bolts on that surface. So if it's a weird angle, you'll probably have difficulties aligning the object. In this case it's 45 degrees, so we can actually just rotate the clones 45 degrees and put them on that surface and align them to the surface. And of course the cloner is pretty flexible because we have options here to change the number of clones, and we have different options regarding the distribution of the clones. Another way of doing this without the need to rotate those clones is, let me select this cube and deselect everything, and I'm going to grab the pen tool. My type is set to linear here. I'm going to switch on snapping, and I'm going to snap to these edges here. Let me just undo that. I'll just start on this edge here. So I'm creating 3 points like this. Switch off snapping, select all the points, switch to my move tool, and I'm going to line these points up by scaling them down to 0. And now we can use this spline to place our clones. So I'm going to use that. And you can see we don't need to, well actually it seems like we do. Let's see what happens if we pick align clones, reset this to 0. Okay, so we still need to rotate them, but it's actually easier because in this case we know that we need to rotate these minus 90 degrees. So that's a pretty easy way of placing these clones. And let's say we just want them on this surface here. We have options to change the count. Let's say we only want 1, and then we can use the offset to put it somewhere on that surface. Let's see what happens if we make that editable. This time we only get 1 clone. Okay, so we can take that and move it around into position if we want to. Make a copy, put that over here. So that is another way of putting objects or placing objects on surfaces of other objects. And I'm pretty sure that what I just showed you is probably not complete. It's all of the options that I know in Cinema 4D with respect to placing objects on surfaces of other objects. So now we will have a look at a couple of plugins that we can use to make our job a lot easier actually. And there will be no need to use Workplanes. I mean, the cloner always is an option depending on what you want to do, because like I showed you before, when I cloned this bolt along a spline, we can change the number of clones and so on and so forth. So the cloner is something that you may still need. But if you just need a couple of objects, there's tools that will help you to get the job done much faster and much easier. The first plugin we're going to have a look at is called Paint on Surface. I'll just go back a few steps. Okay, so Paint on Surface is the first plugin that we're going to have a look at. You can see that this version actually is for release 13. This plugin was discontinued a long while ago. However, it's still working in release 18. And like I said, the bad news is that this plugin was discontinued. The good news is there is a free version for release 20 that is still available. This new version is not working in release 18. I tried to install it and it just doesn't show up in the plugin menu. So it is actually for release 20 and not for older versions of Cinema 4D. However, there is a chance that this free version will work in newer versions of Cinema 4D if you use the Insidyum Bridge to install it. So it's definitely worth a shot. I can't make any promises though, and I don't know because like I said, or as you can see, I'm still using release 18 and I don't really know if it's actually working in newer versions of Cinema 4D. One thing I found out is that, let me just delete this spline here and select one of the objects. One thing I found out is that this new free version for release 20 seems to be a little bit different from this old one that I'm using here. So if you click on Paint on Surface, your attributes manager will probably look a little bit different. They've actually improved the plugin, so it has options that I don't have in this version of Paint on Surface, but you'll have to find out for yourself, because like I said, I can't use it in release 18, so I don't really know. That's just what I heard. I'm not going to do a full tutorial on this. I'm just going to show you basically how this plugin works, so you can see what it does. And the way this works is you need an editable object, and this might be different in the new version for release 20. I think you can also use that new version on parametric objects, but my version, it will only work with editable objects. So let's see, I'm just going to, actually I think I'm just going to delete these and make my null object with all of the bolts and screw heads visible. So the way this works is you need to open a plugin. Let me just close that window here and select the object on which you want to paint. And if it's an editable object in release 18, you can see if I deselect everything, these options are grayed out. If I select an editable object, these options here will become available. And now what I need to do is click on Paint on Surface, and down here in the Attributes Manager you can see this slot, Paint Object, and we need to drag an object in there that we want to paint on the surface. And now all I need to do is left click on the surface to place an object. So no need to change the work planes or anything. And I can even, if I go to point mode, select this point here and bevel it. So let's change the object. I'm going to use this bolt. So I can place my objects anywhere I want, just with a mouse click. And there's a ton of other options that you have down here. I'm not going to show you all of these, but you can see that's a very simple and easy way of getting your objects on these surfaces. So that is Paint on Surface. And you can see that as soon as I painted the first object, Paint on Surface created a null object as a child of this cube here, and it put all of the objects as children of that null object. And there's things you can do like scale the objects. The problem is if I select this object and select Paint on Surface again, and I'll use another object here to paint, it will always add these to the same null object. And even if I deselect the object, reselect it again and select Paint on Surface, let's just drag another object in there. Well, for some reason it doesn't seem to work now. What I wanted to show you is that, why is this not working? So not sure. Let's try that again. So now it's working. It still creates the new objects under this null object. So you can always just scale all of these objects. And if you want that to change, you actually need to move this null object out of here and then start painting new objects, and this will create a new null object. And you can modify those objects by using these parameters here. Okay, so that is Paint on Surface. And I think in the new version, there is an option to create separate null objects that you can adjust separately. And that's one of the improvements of the new free version for release 20. I'm just going to close that, go back to my Move tool. The second plugin we're going to have a look at is called Place Object. This is by C4D Zone. It's a paid plugin. It costs 15 euros. And this one is for newer versions of Cinema 4D as well. I can use it in release 18, although it seems that it's not fully compatible with release 18, but it should be fully working in newer versions of Cinema 4D. So how does this object work? You can see we only have a couple of options. And did I mention the price? It's 15 euros, but it's probably worth it because it makes, it speeds up your workflow, just like Paint on Surface. So if you need to put a lot of details on your objects, it's definitely worth getting a plugin to do that job for you, because as you saw at the beginning of the video, using the Cinema 4D tools always is more work. It takes more steps to get an object onto a surface. And using plugins like this will just make that task a lot easier. So you can see, compared to Paint on Surface, this only has a couple of options here. And this plugin is a bit weird, to be honest, but it does the job. So for me, it was still worth getting it. I just bought it about a week ago or so. So we have this slot here where you can put an object that you want to place on this object here. And this plugin also works with parametric objects, so you can draw these bolts and screws on a parametric cube, for example. So the way this works is you drag an object into that slot and then you can start painting. However, unless you check the clone mode, it will only draw a single copy of this object. And if I click on that surface, this is what happens in release 18. For some reason, the object is placed over here. And I think this doesn't happen if I make, let's use this one. If I make a copy of this and select my cube again, select place object again, and I'm going to drag this screw in there. And now if I left click, for some reason, the object does get placed on that surface. So as soon as I hide this null object, it's working fine. Don't ask why, I have no explanation for that. Now with this plugin, like I said, unless you check the clone mode option, you can only draw this single object here. And as long as the tool is active, you can move it to another position, but that's it. And one thing that I don't like about this plugin is the fact that as soon as you click, the options in the attribute manager disappear. And if I reselect the place object plugin, you can see everything is reset. So the object is gone from the slot. And also, if I check the clone option, which is the one that I always use because it lets you place multiple objects on the surface. The other thing I don't like about this plugin is that usually when you make changes to a tool and you set this as the default, this is what you will get whenever you open the plugin. However, with place object, that just doesn't work. So in order for this plugin to be more pleasant to work with, there's two things that I do. First, I always switch on clone mode. And second, I always lock the attributes manager. Because if I do it like this and I put an object in there, I can start drawing, and you can see as soon as I activate the clone mode, I can place multiple objects just like I could with Paint on Surface. And also the attributes manager doesn't disappear, which is really, it's much more comfortable to work with, because right now, if I want to change the object, I can just put a bolt in there and continue and add this object onto the surfaces of my cube. So, I mentioned that there's a couple of things I don't really like about this plugin. It is a useful addition to Cinema 4D and I actually like using it. So, and if you lock the attributes manager, for example, and switch on clone mode, that's exactly, what I need for most of my projects. Place object does have one very nice feature, and that feature is you can have a list of objects that you can paint. And by the way, you can see up here when you draw these objects, if I unlock the attributes manager, it always creates instances, which is probably helpful. That is something that Paint on Surface doesn't do, at least in the release 18 version. As far as I know, Paint on Surface does allow the creation of instances in the free version for release 20. I'll just delete all of these objects here. Maybe I'll just delete this one too. So we're left with, actually I'll just go back a few steps to here. Okay, so I'll just delete this, let me just unhide these. I can delete that. Okay, so now we're back to where we started with this file. And the feature that I wanted to mention is the ability to use a selection of objects. And the way this works is you can do this in two different ways. I'll do it this way. First of all, select all of the objects that you want to be added to the list of objects that you want to paint. Then you need to go to Select, Selection Filter, and create a selection object. Now, with these objects here selected, if I click on that, all of these objects will be added to the list. But of course, you can also drag and drop them into this list here if you create the selection object without having these objects selected first. So now let's go ahead and we need to select the cube first, then use the place object. I'm going to lock the attributes manager if I can, and then I'm going to drag this selection object into this slot here. And now we get a drop down with all of the objects that we've added to that list. And again, I usually use this in clone mode because if you don't, you can only create one copy of each of the objects in that list. So I usually switch that on. And right now this is set to screw 3, so I can draw this screw, and then I want to change to bolt 2, and I can draw that, and we can change that to the washer and put some of these here. Okay, so that is how place object works. Pretty nice plugin. With a few adjustments, it would be just perfect. So I just had to restart Cinema 4D. I was demonstrating Primitive Sketch and it crashed Cinema 4D. That's what Primitive Sketch does sometimes. So Primitive Sketch is the last plugin we're going to have a look at. Primitive Sketch was discontinued a long while ago. Actually, it was discontinued long before the release of Cinema 4D 18. And the only reason I can still use it in release 18 is because, unlike with other plugins, Primitive Sketch was tied, or the serial number of Primitive Sketch was tied to your email address and not to the Cinema 4D serial number. So let's have a look at how Primitive Sketch works. You can find it in the plugin menu. And by the way, I heard that you can still download it somewhere on the internet. I'm not sure if that's totally legal. I mean, it is an old plugin, it has been discontinued, but still, if you can find it, it's probably not a legal version. I've also heard that you can actually use it with newer versions of Cinema 4D if you install the Insidyum Bridge. But personally, I don't know. Like I said, I bought it a long time ago. There's no need for me to go and look for it. So the way Primitive Sketch works is if you open it and take a look at the Attributes Manager, you have a couple of tabs here. The first one is the Primitives tab, and here you can select the type of object you want to create. If you open this drop down, you can see that we get all of the Cinema 4D primitives as well as all parametric spline objects in Cinema 4D, which is pretty cool. And if you want to do something like you can do with AutoGrid in 3ds Studio Max, you would probably select the box. And then what you can do is just left click and drag out a box. If you hold down Shift, you can snap to the dimensions, and then you can draw a cube like this. Again, I could snap this to create even numbers here. And you can even draw primitives on top of the new primitives, the new objects you created. And these objects will be created right on top of the surface of this object here. Okay, and you can always switch to another object if you want to. I'm not sure if these are created on the surface. They are. So that's pretty cool. You can interactively draw objects on top of other objects. And Primitive Sketch also has an option to use custom objects. You have a custom tab here. I'm actually not sure how this works. I'll probably need to switch this to custom, and then the options should become available here. You have an object list and you can drag one or more objects in there, and then you can draw these objects on the surface. And with custom objects, you don't really draw these, you just left click to place the object. And I'm not sure, I thought there was an option to scale these. So you can actually, if you left click and drag, create objects of different sizes. That is something you cannot do with place object or paint on surface. Although I think I mentioned it before, with the free version of paint on surface for release 20, I think you can actually modify individual clones as well. Okay, so that would be primitive objects and primitive sketch, I'm sorry. And primitive sketch is the only plugin that does what AutoGrid does. So this is the end of this tutorial. I hope you've learned a few things about placing objects on surfaces of other objects. So thank you for watching, take care, and I'll see you again soon.